Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast. So today our guest is Louis de Bernières Smart, who, as I'm sure you all know, is an author of many fine books. Perhaps the first one that people think of is Captain Corelli's Mandolin, which was made into a film which didn't totally reflect the book. But anyway, many thanks for coming along and joining us today, Louis.
Hi Louis, really good to see you, and I'm a massive fan of your book, so I was delighted when you agreed to come on the podcast. Thank you.
So Louis, we've had quite a few conversations with people who went to boarding school over the past 3 years. How old were you when you were sent away, and what was it like for you?
I was 8 years old and about 9 months. And I suppose that from a family like mine, it was just completely expected and usual, and so nothing out of the ordinary. And so everybody deceives themselves into thinking that it actually is reasonable and normal. I mean, when I arrived there, I found that, that one was even at the age of 8, one was likely to be beaten with a slipper for the slightest misdemeanor, and you'd end up with a great black mark on a slipper-shaped black mark on your backside. The food was absolutely appalling. Sometimes it was 2 tin tomatoes on a piece of white toast. We had no proper heating, so there was often frost on the inside of the windows. We had to wear shorts even through the winter, so we had chaps up the insides of our legs and chilblains on our toes. Both of the headmasters were, in one way or another, somewhat pedophile, and one of them was a sadist. And the one who was sort of less harmful, he would put his hand up your shorts and sit you on his knee, but it never sort of went any further, as far as I know. The other headmaster was, he wanted to dry our private parts after naked swimming, and he was a thrasher. He'd been tortured by the Germans in the Second World War, and he had hideous scars across his back. I think he'd probably been whipped with an electric flex, and I think, was taking it out on us. And the trouble with that, and he would twist your cheeks between his fingers, like that, while smiling down at you with this great looming red face and calling you pet names, which are usually quite insulting, like lousy Louis, And so the trouble with his thrashing regime was that it sort of set up an ethos of bullying and violence through the whole school. There were a number of bullies, older boys, who were just relentlessly savage. There was a lot of scapegoating and picking on unfortunate people. I mean, there was a boy who was spastic, for example, who was shameless, who was just relentlessly tormented until he had to leave. The violence was physical, and it was also emotional. And looking back on it now, I think that the way I dealt with it was by just shutting down emotionally on the first day of every term. And then on the last day of term, when you go home, trying to be a normal little boy again. And it was very, very difficult. We were, in any case, of that generation who were taught that stoicism was the important thing, that boys don't cry, you stand up for yourself, if somebody hits you, you hit them back. I think we were being brought up as little Spartan warriors, because all the people teaching us had been through the Second World War, and if you think about it, at that time we were all of us expecting the Third World War, because the Cold War was going on, and there was the prospect of nuclear annihilation, war with Russia, the Soviet Union. And I think we were being brought up to be really, really tough, and actually we are really tough, my generation, and we are self-sufficient and independent. All that stuff worked, but I think it was crippling emotionally. Apart from anything else, my boarding school was a single-sex boarding school, so we were cut off from half the population just automatically. There was a matron there who was a horrendous old dragon with a huge chunk out of her neck, and her head wobbled. She was vile to us, probably worse than the male teachers anyway, but worse than the headmaster. So you go through that sort of institution, and women, females are just a sort of fantasy which only come to any kind of reality in the holidays. And if you think about it, the holidays were much shorter than the terms. I think it poisoned my relationship with my mother. My mother and I got on incredibly well. She did all the things my father didn't, like teach me how to play hockey and football and golf and squash and so on. And we used to go tobogganing, and we had a tremendous amount of fun. But all my life, I had this sort of feeling of anger or rage, which was quite hard to suppress. And I only realized very late in life that I think I was blaming her for sending me away. I didn't blame my father because he wasn't the primary caregiver. And I think it also affects your ability to attach. You become very shielded. You know, as Wilhelm Reich used to call armor. You're kind of armor plated, and you attach in ways that don't work. Like you can get it. I've found that, for example, I've only been able to get really attached to women who I thought were likely to leave me. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And the really good women, the ones that would have been good for me, kind of frightened me away. And obviously, I might have been like that anyway. I don't know whether if I hadn't been through those kinds of institutions, I would have turned out like this or not. But I feel that it did spoil my natural ability to attach to the right kind of people.
You're highlighting something really important there, though, aren't you? About how, on the face of it, common sense might lead people who don't think about psychology to think that, well, you'll choose safe women, but actually, quite often that can then feel frightening, can't it? To choose the kind of person that you really need, because it feels so unfamiliar or so different. You know, the idea that someone might be there constantly.
Well, the thing is, if you're thoroughly attached, I mean, with total commitment to, say, your mother and your sisters and the family dog and the 2 cats and so on and so forth, you become terrified of that attachment being taken away. I mean, it is taken away from you on a regular basis, and it's very painful. So you choose not to attach to the sort of people you ought to be attaching. You know, the people like your sisters and your mother. And does that make sense to me? I mean, to you? I mean, yeah, I think it makes.
Yes, it makes a lot of sense, Louis. And I was thinking as you were talking, though, something quite distinct. It sounds as though you allowed yourself to take that wall down every time you went home, and you were reconnecting with your family in a way that sometimes people talk about this wall going up and then not being able to bring it down again.
It took me all my life to bring the wall down. My father didn't really become a good father until he was quite an old man. I mean, he was learning himself how to be an emotional being, and when he was an old man, he was, for example, able to say, "I love you." He couldn't possibly have said that when he was in his 30s. Absolutely not. You know, he'd been through the Second World War. He'd seen his whole regiment wiped out in one battle. And his father had disappeared when he was a little boy, so he didn't know how to be a father. He had to learn it himself as he got older. I forgot what your question was. I'm sorry.
No, I suppose it sounded as though there was a part of you that still tried to connect each time you went home, in a way that sometimes people describe keeping that wall well and truly up.
I didn't do it very successfully. I did it most successfully, to be honest, with the family dog. He was like the brother that I didn't have. And when I was very small and I couldn't sleep at night, I would just go and sleep with him in the basket. I mean, luckily he was a very big dog with a very big basket, so he was my emotional anchor, really, rather than my mother or my sisters. Um, I sort of feel there's nothing wrong with that as long as you've got someone to rely on. Um, I found it very hard, but because of this simmering anger I had, I found it very hard to sort of relate to my mother as she deserved and as we should have done. Um, and I mean, when I was about 17 or 18, I was so dammed up with, really with quite a violent emotion, which I can't really pin down. I don't know whether it was rage or sexual frustration or whatever. It was all those things put together. I was so dammed up that I actually knew I had to do something about it. I realized I had to do something about it, or I'd end up being self-destructive. And I went up to the attic of my parents' house and I sat there until I taught myself to cry. And it worked. I think that was, in a way, my salvation. And now I cry too easily. It makes my children laugh.
Well, I was just going to say, there's a kind of wisdom in that, though, isn't there? That you knew that at some level what you needed to do was to be able to cry, because I think quite often people don't end up having that realization. But you knew there'd be something healing and cathartic about doing that, which I think is quite striking.
I don't know if it's a question of knowledge. I didn't sort of think I knew it would be therapeutic. I just knew I had to do it. Slight difference. Yeah. Yeah. And now I cry if I see something beautiful, or it's quite embarrassing.
I was thinking, Louis, that you were kind of describing these major transitions which took place several times each year when you went off to school and when you went home from school, and as if you had to kind of grit your teeth and get on with things in between those two transitions. So I wondered whether actually the freezing that you're kind of hinting at, particularly in relation to your mother, was something that became more difficult and more problematic with each repeat.
It became a bit easier because as you got older, or went from 8 to 13. When you were one of the older boys, obviously you had far less bullying because there weren't that so many people who could give you a thumping and get you in a headlock and stick your head down the lavatory. So as you got older, it obviously got better. And when you were 8 and you arrived there, the first thing that happened to you was a rite of passage, which consisted of being thrown in the prickly bush, which was extremely prickly. Of course, by the time you were 13, that had all eased off. But you still had all the other kinds. You still occasionally got a thumping, and there was a terrific temptation to become a bully yourself, because that's how you project the powerful facade which will stop people picking on you. And then I was sent to a public school afterwards, which was far, far more civilized. There was no physical bullying. There was quite a lot of psychological bullying, torment, so psychological torment, sort of teasing and mockery and so on. But and my generation at that school put an end to beating. When I arrived at that school, the prefects were still allowed to beat you. By the time I left, even the headmaster wasn't. So there was a revolution going on in the way that we thought about education and how to look after children. This is in the I suppose in the early 70s. But the one thing I have to say about being in that prep school, which was so brutal, was that when I went home in the holidays, what it made me value more than anything else was the beautiful countryside that my parents lived in. We lived in the Surrey Hills, and I would spend hours out in the Surrey Hills with the dog. I could go out all day with the dog and not come back until it was dark, just knowing where all the bluebells were and the kingcups, and where the streams with tadpoles were, and which brook had trout in it. That was the one I think positive thing that came out of being stuck in that prep school by the seaside in Kent. It made me appreciate just how wonderful it was to live in the Surrey Hills. It's given me an attachment to nature, which I've always had through my life. And the school afterwards was in the middle of the Berkshire countryside, and it was a much nicer place anyway. And I spent hours and hours wandering around the Englefield estate. I even worked for a local farmer when I was supposed to be doing weightlifting and things. Mr. Ballston would give me 2 and 6 for sorting out the potatoes.
It's interesting to hear you describe it as an attachment to nature, almost like a person, as if nature was taking that place that a mum and dad should be doing, but because you're deprived of that you then put this attachment onto nature.
Yeah, I'm not a romantic in the sort of sense that William Wordsworth would have been. I'm more of a nature addict in the sense that Ted Hughes was. That he was totally aware of how absolutely brutal and horrible nature was. He was quite happy to write poems about dead sheep, and that's how I see nature. I think of nature as a sort of a beautiful but brutal tyrant.
Yes. But Louis, you've been hinting at this already, and there's quite a lot of evidence that boarding school can leave people emotionally stunted. But you, of course, are known for emotionally evocative writing in your books like Captain Corelli's Mandolin and Bird Without Wings. So how did you manage to hold on to your ability to feel and to express what you feel?
I think that's many things. I was always falling in love, with I don't know, for example, with girls who were also at boarding schools, who I saw in the holidays and was just too shy to speak to, and they were too shy to speak to me. But I was always in love with these unattainable, lovely girls. So my heart was always, thumping away. I also, from a very early age, loved poetry, which I think opens you up emotionally quite a lot. When I was 18, I went to live for a year in Colombia, in the countryside. I was working on a hacienda, on a ranch, and of course, the culture of Colombia, rural Colombia, couldn't be more different from the culture of Great Britain back then. That was a transformative experience being in South America for a year, because they just don't think and act and talk the way we do. And when I came back, it took me a good 10 years to feel British ever again. And I think that going away to a tropical country like that, where people may be poor, but they're often exuberant and joyful, and unrestrained. I mean, the downside of it is that their violence is unrestrained. They will hack you with a machete if you molest their 16-year-old daughter, but they will also have a wildly great time dancing to a wind-powered record player. So I came back from Colombia, I think, very much changed by that experience, and with a perspective on my own culture that I couldn't possibly have had if I hadn't gone abroad.
How old were you then?
I was 19. I was 19.
Right. So that's quite a young age, isn't it? But also a very adventurous age, 19.
I had just been in another institution, though, because I'd been destined for the army. My father was a cavalry officer, and he was hoping I'd go into his old regiment. the army paid some of my school fees, and so I had to go into the army when I left school. I had no choice. I had to go for officer training, and those were hippie days when people like me just wanted to play the guitar and grow their hair long and say peace. It didn't sort of fit with the way things were for my generation, anyway. And but I found it. I lasted 5 months. Another month, and I would have graduated as an officer. Um, but after 5 months of feeling that there was something terribly wrong about this, um, an Irish company sergeant major from the Irish Guards, he said to me, you know, the reason we succeed with all these other cadets is that they're army balmy. They want us to change them. He said, the trouble with you is you don't want us to change you, so we can't. So you better go and do something else. And that's the best advice I've ever had in my life from anybody. It's life-changing good advice from quite an unexpected source. But one thing I learnt at Sandhurst really was something that civilians don't understand at all, which is comradeship. I suppose what the Aussies call mateship. I don't think civilians have the slightest idea of that kind of love, and I feel quite privileged to have learnt it myself.
Well, in some ways, going to Sandhurst seems quite a conventional next move for a former border, whereas to then go off to Colombia sounds very unconventional, given the background that you had. I just wondered what it was about you that gravitated towards more of the hippie, unconventional lifestyle as opposed to clinging to an institution, I suppose, because I guess the rigidity of prep and boarding school, public school, and then going into the military probably would have felt quite familiar for some people.
Yeah, I wouldn't have been a very good hippie. I was only a sort of fringe kind of hippie. I found it very, very irritating the way that people would just waft around so far out, you know, and uh, it there was a lack of intellectual grit and intelligence about hippiedom, which really grated on me. But I liked the sort of, although it was terribly conformist in a rather ironical way, because the hippies were just trying to be like each other. I liked the way that people were thinking about different ways of getting through their lives, and I I think because of my background and my rebellion against it, I just thought I never want to have a job in my life where I have to wear a tie. And you know, I never have. I've never had to wear a tie to work in my life, apart from when I was at Sandhurst or at school. You know, so it's a tiny, tiny little ambition, but I've kind of pulled that one off.
But I was quite intrigued by that because when I looked on your, looked up your bio and the fact that you've worked as a hospital porter, a landscape gardener, a mechanic in a Bent Morris minor garage, and you've been a teacher of truants. And I did wonder, was this what your family envisaged for you when they invested heavily in your education? Not to disparage doing those jobs, but I think people invest in public school for a reason, don't they?
Yes. When I dropped out of Sandhurst, my father was initially extremely angry, and my mother was disappointed. My father actually said to me, "You'll be a failure all your life," and it was quite a good thing for him to have said, because I took it as a challenge. I thought, right, I'll show you, even if I had to do it in a very roundabout way. And years later, when I was a published author and doing very well, I reminded my father of what he'd said. And he said, what I meant was, if you carry on like that, you'll be a failure all your life. And of course, he was right about that. I couldn't go on just starting things and then dropping them after 4 months. I mean, he was, I think, right. But it's just in that one case, I made the correct decision, and my father luckily turned out to be wrong. And of course, by the time I was in my 40s, my parents were completely proud of me and reconciled to what I'd done. And one of the nice things was that my father's old comrades also told him that I'd done the right thing.
But again, I suppose that's back to it. It might not be conscious, but I suppose it's back again to a sense of internal inherent wisdom. Making decisions that are actually about what you need, in the same way of going up into the attic and crying. It might not be conscious, but there's a sense of choosing a path that worked for you rather than choosing the path that other people might have had you head on down.
I think we listen to our bodies, don't we? If you've got that sinking feeling or that feeling of dread in the pit of your stomach, then you know you're on the wrong track. And I listen to my body.
So, Louis, how has someone coming from this background of privilege managed to form connections with people from such diverse sections of society? A hacienda in Colombia, they're working with truants, working in a garage. How have you managed to form these connections?
I think it's because I'm deeply interested in what it's like to be other people. So I'm likely to find a welder from Stoke Newington probably more interesting than a merchant banker from Weybridge. You follow me? I'm really interested in what it's like to be other people. It's a good habit to have if you're a writer. Um, I I try not to pull middle class rank, if you know what I mean. I try to treat people as equals. I try not to act entitled. I don't know if I always succeed, um, but I try and keep conscious the notion that human beings are mostly of equal value and of equal interest. That's what it is. And with blokes in the garage, there couldn't be anything more fun because you're just spending all day making up filthy lyrics to pop songs and telling stupid jokes. It's just fun. It doesn't matter whether they're, working class or a duke.
When working in a prison, we hosted two playwrights, Simon Stevens and John Donnelly. They both came in, and I think there's something about writing that makes people really curious about people. So their ability to connect with people and have meaningful conversations, was really powerful. Whereas I think there are other people who could come into those environments and find it very difficult. Would be quite intimidated and find it quite hard to connect.
I've had a couple of fun sessions in prison.
I wondered how all your experiences of, how have these contributed to your writing? The fact that you have had such diverse work employment.
During those 10 years or so when it looked as though I was going nowhere, I was actually accumulating lots of interesting research. Um, so I know what it's like to fire a machine gun. I know what it's like to throw a hand grenade or sleep in a freezing trench all night. I know what it's like to lasso a horse. Um, I could mend any British car up to about the year 1980. Um, it all turned out to be things which would be of some use later on in one way or another. I even managed to write a radio play called Sunday Morning at the Centre of the World, which was uh, really written in London, written in the London dialect, and that's because I picked it up when I was living for all those years in Earlsfield. I can still pass as an Earlsfielder.
So, Louis, I'm fascinated by the hints you've dropped about working in a garage, and I gather it was something you mentioned, a bent Morris Minor garage. And I wonder what that was like. Now, I had a short experience, not of working in a garage exactly, but of working in a tyre yard, these places that sell tyres. And I could only do it for a short while because I found it unbearable. I found I just couldn't keep up with the level of rather sort of cruel humour laced with sexual innuendo, which was more or less continuous, and I couldn't cope with it.
I quite enjoyed all that. we were a funny bunch in the garage. I mean, we had one welder. He's a black guy. He turned up in a white suit to work, with all covered with bling and stuff. And he didn't last long. He didn't last long because he didn't want to get dirty. The next welder said he'd be in the deep sea diver and in the SAS. Obvious rubbish, you know. We had a Turk called Tommy, and Tommy had married an English woman because it was more fun playing volleyball in England than it was in Turkey. I mean, the guy spraying the cars would get so stoned on the thinners that after he'd finished a job, he'd just lie out in the yard giggling. And every day we would go off and fetch a huge mound of kebabs and chips. And I have to say, it was exhausting. I was completely ingrained with filth. I mean, I couldn't go out with a girl with hands like that. But it was. I actually enjoyed all the things which I think you probably hated. And that might have been because it's a bit like that being at public school. You know, singing rugby songs in the showers.
Thank you for that insight. I think you could probably write a book about that. Maybe you have done already, and I've missed it.
I was thinking of writing a book about my time at the prep school, but it's becoming a bit pointless because other people are doing it just as well. Like Charles Spencer has just published a book about his experience at Mayfield, which is almost identical to mine. And I sort of feel, well, you know, Charles has done it. No, I don't really have to.
Well, I think that's really interesting because we've had a few conversations with people who've been to boarding school, and I think every conversation has been different because something different has stood out for. So you see similar themes across those conversations, but actually I think there is something quite different about each person's story. And as you were talking earlier, one of the things that really stood out for me was you contextualizing your experiences to that period of time in terms of set against, you know, the backdrop of the, you know, just being 2 world wars and against the Cold War. And did that really leave any space for, you know, if boarding schools emerged to, you know, fulfill empire and be able to be tough and make the country strong and not vulnerable, you know, was there really space for boarding schools to change at that point in time? You know, there's a function to it in some way, isn't there?
Yes, I mean, there is a theory that the purpose of those schools was to provide personnel for the empire. And up to a point, I think that's true. I mean, 2 of my great uncles were killed in the Boer War. Another great uncle died of cholera in India. And one of my beef with the empire is that it killed so many of us in so many horrible ways. You know, we ourselves were also the victims of all that. I mean, every one of our families must have a dozen dead relatives we don't even remember, who were sent to awful places to die in horrible ways. But it sort of makes me wonder what those kinds of schools are for now. They just seem to be people's, as in my day, people come out supremely self-confident, but I think probably emotionally rather dodgy. And they also come out, of course, with very useful social contacts, which they can exploit if they want to get a job in the city or whatever. You know, it is a vast networking project, I think. I never got involved in all that network project because my life went off at a tangent.
No, but maybe your story is more about how you held on to your emotionality to be able to channel that into books in the way that you have.
Yeah, I suppose so. You know, but the funny thing is, I'm in touch with quite a lot of people from my past, and most of them have in one way or another had successful lives. But quite a few of them feel that they've sort of inexplicably had fucked up marriages. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or not being good enough fathers and only realised when it was too late. That sort of thing. and obviously I don't know how that applies to people from other social backgrounds. Then maybe they've got the same experiences, but for different reasons.
Louis, you spent quite a long time fighting for the right to continue to see your children following your divorce. What impact did that period have on your life?
Um, when the fiasco suddenly happened, I think that was the lowest point of my entire life. Um, because becoming a father was what finally allowed me to become truly myself. Um, in other words, the children became the meaning of my life. The wonderful thing about parenthood is that, well, for me anyway, was that it allowed me to give up selfishness. I could I could start living for other people instead of for myself, and I found that truly liberating. It was a kind of it made me happy in a way that a liberation ought to. And so when I suddenly found that you know I got I don't want to sort of criticize my ex. I don't want to say nasty things about her. I think she was misled by family lawyers who were fleecing her until every single penny had gone. And at the end of all that, we sorted it out in 2 sessions of mediation. So I blame the lawyers, and for her being as emotionally confused as I was. So I don't want to give you gory details, but there was a point when she'd taken the children away, with her having agreed that we would share them 50-50. The day after, I got a letter from her solicitor saying that I could have them for every other weekend, and the weekend would begin on Saturday morning and end on Sunday evening at 4 o'clock. And I just hit the roof. I took it to court, and it took me, I think, maybe 2 years to get this all sorted out. I think my ex realized that it was incredibly hard work trying to bring up children on their own, on her own. It is such hard work. It's not funny being a single parent. It's not something that anyone with any sense would choose on purpose. And I think she was utterly exhausted and was quite relieved to give me my 50%. And also, I think that she, in the end, compassion kicked in, and she realized that the children needed me as much as they needed her. And it's ever since then, the situation has got more and more free and easy. So now it's just a question of, and I see them all every day. My ex Kathy sees us all every day, pretty much. She's only in the next village, and we share the kids really on a practical basis now. It's like, if I had them on Monday, can you have them on Thursday? This kind of thing. It's all completely sorted out because the lawyers are not there anymore.
Well, it's good to hear that's come to such a satisfactory position, Louis.
Yeah, I was talking to my daughter the other day about how parents typically, after separation, usually the father loses contact eventually because, especially if the mother moves a long way away and takes the kids, it's impossible. And I was talking to my daughter about that, and she said, well, where's the problem? Well, my daughter doesn't think there's a problem. She's like, this morning I took her to school and dropped her bag off at her mum's. You know what I mean? That's how it ought to work, and we're still a family, in other words.
Yes, thank you. So I was really struck when a few moments ago you were describing really how becoming a father was such an important development for you, and you found that you were able to relate to your children, and that relationship was so important. And it reminded me actually, whilst you were talking, of your repeated references to your dog when you're at home, and how it was so important for you to be able to develop a close relationship. I hope that doesn't sound fatuous, but I was really struck by that.
No, I don't think there's a hierarchy of love, really. As a writer, I'm interested in all the kinds of love, so the love between humans and animals, is just as interesting as the love between a parent and a child. Although whether one is better than the other, I mean, who knows? It's all love, isn't it?
So you've described really a very full life, and earlier on you mentioned that your lifetime experiences have, in a way, been researched for your books. Do you plan your books? You sit down and plan them, or do they just emerge from the kind of experience, the wealth of experience that you've had?
It's like a planned pregnancy. So something starts it off, and then you've got a long period of gestation where you're just thinking about it, characters coming in and out of your mind, images coming in and out of your mind, voices. I think of it as a kind of really useful paranoid schizophrenia. So, if it got any worse, I probably had to be locked up. But there comes like a pregnancy. There comes a point when the baby has to emerge. It's the same with getting down to a book. I expect you to have written books, haven't you? So you know what it's like. Haven't you both written books?
Yes, but not creative ones in the way you
No,
have.
but you know what I mean. There comes a point where the gestation's over. You have to give birth to it.
Yes. You stop being a perfectionist.
That's how it is.
Yeah. Many people will find your books very nourishing to read, Louis. How does writing nourish you? And you've obviously chosen to build that as a career.
Well, I normally, my flip response to this is that it's a hell of a lot better than working. I think it nourishes me in the same way that it does the reader who reads. I mean, I'm getting images and voices and stories the same as a reader is, really. And I know that if I wasn't an avid reader, I wouldn't be able to write anything. So probably what I'm doing is recycling stuff. It's coming in one eye, and with coming in through my eyes, sort of festering in my mind, and then coming out of my fingers. My daughter said that she'd quite like to be a writer, and I said, Sophie, you'll never be a writer if you don't read. You've really got, so I think we're like computers. You only get in what you only get out what you put in. If you put good stuff in, you'll get good stuff out. You put crap in, you'll get crap out. It's simple. And I know one lovely thing about writing is that you have adventures. Mario Vargas Llosa said that what he loved about writing was that you could have adventures which you never otherwise could have at all. So, for example, he wrote a very, very funny novel about a Peruvian army officer trying to set up a military brothel in the jungle. It's hilarious. And of course, that's nothing that Mario Vargas Llosa had ever done personally. But he had all the fun of being Captain Pantoja without even having to leave his flat in Lima.
That's a lovely way of depicting it. But I was also thinking, Louis, are the particular ingredients that you look to add into your books? Because from reading them, many of them seem to be, there's a strong theme of love within them. There's also often a lot of sadness. Quite often, I mean, one of the things I've appreciated about your books is quite often learn something historical at the same time as reading this story that's at centre stage to that. But is there an intentionality about what's going in? Do you decide what those ingredients are going to be in advance?
No, it's not that deliberate. It just comes out like that. As I say, I'm interested in all the different kinds of love. I am very interested in history, and it has often been the case that I've had my best ideas because of coming across some untold history. That's particularly the case with Captain Corelli and Birds Without Wings. Most people had never heard of the population exchange between the Greeks and the Turks in 1923. So that was a revelation to a lot of people. And most people didn't even know that Greece had been involved in the Second World War. So coming across untold stories is I think, it's a great bonus. And I'm quite an avid interviewer of people. I'm especially interested in interviewing very old people. So when I was writing Captain Crowley or Birds Without Wings, there actually were people still alive who just remembered all those things, or could tell you their dad's stories or tell you their grandmother's stories. And I would always just say, well, can I have it? And they'd say yes. So people might think that I'm making all these stories up, but quite often I'm not. I'm actually thieving them.
So Louis, you're also an accomplished musician and you've received excellent reviews for your music. How does writing and making music differ from writing novels for you as a creative output? What do you get out of making music that you don't get out of the books that you write?
Music is somehow much less mediated than writing. For example, if you're playing the flute, it's like turning your spirit into breath, or express. How can I externalizing your spirit by means of your breath? Does that make sense? It's a terrific emotional catharsis playing music. It's also a wonderful form of meditation because it closes down all the annoying clutter or the annoying white noise which plagues most of us. Well, it does me anyway. I get a constant intrusion of stray thoughts and so on. So an annoying lack of focus. When you're playing music, you're very, very focused, and that shuts down all the parts of your mind that annoy you. The bit that tells you that it's about time you clean the sink. That's all gone. I think of it as my way of doing meditation. I've tried meditation and I got bored out of my head within 30 seconds. It doesn't suit me at all. But music is how I sort of calm myself down and express my feelings and escape from myself. Writing is also a good way of escaping from yourself because you might, for example, be writing a passage in which you're imagining what it's like to be a 6-year-old girl. We are a society which has become very sort of narcissistic and self-obsessed, and I think it's music and reading and so on. These are all ways in which we escape from this torment which we inflict on ourselves.
Really, we're just trying to get even more from you, Louis. Is there any advice that you'd offer up to listeners about how they can take care of their own well-being?
What, beyond the really sensible things like don't eat sugar?
Well, you can have that in there if it's on your list.
Well, I gave up all the high glycemic carbs, and I'm 20 years younger now. It's extraordinary the difference. If you cut out sugar and start white bread and stuff, it's amazing how your health improves. And then obviously, if your physical health is good, your mental health gets better. But yeah, mens sana in corpore sano. So, oh God, I was going to say, have children and fall in love with them. But I don't know. I mean, for some people, it's enough to have 3 cats, isn't it?
Become immersed in music and have children.
It's like, I think it's John Donne's advice. No man is an island. We're part of the main. You think of yourself as part of a big communal enterprise. Don't think of yourself as some heroic solitary individual battling your way through life.
That's great.
Okay, thanks very much. That was a really thoughtful conversation. Thanks so much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for giving us your time today, Louis. It's been a lovely conversation to have. Thank you.